Welcome to the Mad Genius Thesis. Today, we're diving into a question that's kind of fascinated people for centuries.
Uh, is there a link between genius and madness?
You got it. It's a topic that's, fueled tons of debates and even, inspired art literature, even scientific inquiry.
It really has.
Yeah. And we're going to be looking at this question through the lens of the Beat generation,
Yep.
specifically Allen Ginsberg and his experiences.
Interesting choice. Ginsberg's life and work are definitely a good way to examine this question.
Yeah, to kick things off, I found this story about Ginsberg during his time in the Navy in World War II. That really caught my eye.
Oh, yeah.
He was discharged after being diagnosed with schizophrenia.
You're right. His
Huh.
time in the Navy was marked by a bunch of rebellious acts that ended up with that diagnosis.
Yeah, there's sources say that he abandoned his rifle during a drill and even said he was old Samuel Johnson when the psychiatrist questioned him. It's
Yep.
like he was acting out a literary rebellion while at war.
Huh. It really shows how complex this all is. Was it actual rebellion, or was it his mental state, or both? It's hard to tell sometimes.
That's what makes this topic so interesting, right? It's
Huh.
not about easy answers, but about exploring the nuances and the gray areas. It's about understanding the human experience with all its messiness.
And Ginsberg's life and work definitely show that messiness. He was a brilliant poet, a social activist, and he openly dealt with mental health challenges.
Yeah. One of the sources, The Portable Beat Reader, edited by Ann Charters, really dives into Ginsberg's desire to write a novel with a madman as the hero. What are your thoughts on that?
It's a really interesting point. I think it shows that Ginsberg was fascinated with the outsider, with people who challenge what society thinks is normal. He saw mental illness not as something to be ashamed of, but as something that could bring creativity and insight.
That's different from how mental illness is usually seen, right? Instead of seeing it something scary or something to hide, he saw it as something to explore and even celebrate.
And that's a key theme in his most famous work, How.
Absolutely. How is raw and visceral, and so honest in how it explores madness, societal oppression, and the search for meaning. He takes his own experiences, his observations of others struggling with mental illness, and puts it all into this incredibly powerful work of art.
And it's important to remember what was going on at the time. Ginsberg wasn't writing in a bubble. This was the Cold War, a time of intense anxiety, paranoia, and pressure to conform. It was a time when being an individual was often seen as a threat.
Are you saying that this societal pressure could have played a role in the mental health struggles of Ginsberg and other artists of the time?
It's definitely something to consider. Imagine the weight of those expectations, the fear of being labeled different or un-American.
Which makes the Beat generation even more remarkable. They embrace nonconformity and challenge the very structure of American society in their art, their lifestyle, and their outspoken views.
Exactly. Figures like Jack Kerouac also thought the 1950s were suffocatingly conformist. He saw the rise of television and the Cold War paranoia as things that contributed to this stifling atmosphere.
It sounds like both Ginsberg and Kerouac felt like outsiders and used their creativity as a form of rebellion and to challenge the status quo.
There's a sense of kinship there, a shared understanding of the darkness and the light that can come from a creative mind that works outside of convention.
It looks like there's a pattern here, a connection between societal pressures, the desire to break free, and the exploration of mental states in their work.
And it raises important questions about if there's a link between mental illness and heightened creativity, and whether certain mental states, while definitely challenging, might also open doors to new ways of seeing and experiencing the world.
It's tricky, right? We don't want to romanticize mental illness. It's a real health problem that causes pain and suffering. But there are so many examples of artists and writers who made incredible work while also fighting their own demons.
Recognizing that complexity is crucial. We need to acknowledge the struggles while being open to exploring the potential connections between certain mental states and being creative.
And it's not the same for everyone. Ginsberg's experiences were good and bad. His mental illness influenced his art, but it also led to really hard times and hospital stays.
Absolutely. Mental illness is a spectrum, and how it affects someone's life can be very different from person to person.
And back then, in the 1950s, there was so much stigma around mental illness. It was something to hide, something to be ashamed of.
Which makes you wonder how many people suffered silently, unable to get help or support because they were afraid of being judged or ostracized.
That brings up an important point. How does this relate to how we see mental health today? Have we gotten better at not stigmatizing these issues?
That's a good question to think about. We've come a long way, but we still have work to do to make a society where people feel okay asking for help and support without being judged.
So we have this backdrop of the Cold War, this intense societal pressure, and this artistic movement pushing back against conformity.
Yeah.
Let's focus on Ginsberg's personal life. His mother, Naomi, struggled with paranoid schizophrenia for years, and her struggles seem to have had a huge impact on him.
Naomi is a very important figure in Ginsberg's life and work. She's a tragic figure whose creative potential was overshadowed by her illness.
In his poem, Kaddish Ginsberg deals with his mother's illness, the effect it had on his family, and the bigger questions about mental illness and its impact.
Kaddish is a really personal and powerful piece. It explores family dynamics, love loss, and trying to find meaning in the middle of chaos.
It's not just about Naomi's illness, though. It's about the whole family dynamic and how mental illness can affect everyone it touches. There's a rawness and honesty in how he explores these difficult emotions.
He doesn't shy away from the pain, the anger, even resentment that can happen when dealing with mental illness in a family. It's a relatable human story.
And it's interesting that his father, Louis, was also a poet. It's like we're seeing this interplay between family legacy, creative expression, and mental illness.
That adds another layer to the story, doesn't it? Louis represented a more traditional way of writing poetry, while Alan was drawn to a more free-flowing, experimental style. It's almost like he was rebelling against his father's legacy while also being influenced by it.
Sounds like there was tension there. A desire to break free from expectations, both from society and his family.
There was, and it's a tension that a lot of creative people deal with, that need to find their own voice to make their own path, even if it means challenging those who came before them.
Makes you wonder how much of Ginsberg's rebellion came from this internal struggle, this desire to break free from the mold.
That's an interesting question, and one that we'll keep exploring as we get deeper into his life and work.
So we have this backdrop of the Cold War, this intense societal pressure, this complex family dynamic, and then we have Ginsberg, this young, ambitious, and really sensitive artist trying to find his voice in the middle of it all.
It's a lot to unpack, and we've only just started. In the next part of our deep dive, we'll explore Ginsberg's journey as an artist, his influences, and how he grew as a writer. We'll trace the path that led him to create Howl, a poem that changed American poetry.
That's a good point to pause for now. We'll be back with more of the Mad Genius thesis after a short break.
Okay.
See you soon.
Before we go any further with Ginsberg's story, I think it's important to point out that this tension between tradition and rebellion wasn't just with his dad, it was in his literary influences too.
Yeah, that's true. He was clearly a big reader, and you can see all these other writers and poets in his work.
He took inspiration from a lot of places, from the romantic poets like William Blake and William Wordsworth, to the modernists like T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound, to the other beat writers like Jack Kerouac and William S. Burroughs.
But he wasn't just copying styles or techniques, was he? It seems like he took the core of these writers and made them his own.
Exactly. He was like a sponge absorbing everything he read and then putting it through his own creative filter. He created something new, something that showed both his deep knowledge of literary history and his own unique view of the world.
One writer that seems really important is Walt Whitman. You can see Whitman's influence all over Howl, from the long lines to celebrating the human body to the American spirit.
Whitman was a huge influence on Ginsberg throughout his whole career. He saw in Whitman this radical acceptance of democracy, of individuality, of the beauty and complexity of being human, all themes that are really important in Ginsberg's work.
It's like Ginsberg saw himself as continuing what have. Whitman started pushing the boundaries of American poetry even further.
And it wasn't just American writers. Ginsberg was also really influenced by European writers and thinkers, especially the French poets like Arthur Rimbaud and Charles Baudelaire.
You're right. He seemed drawn to Rimbaud's rebellious spirit, his exploration of the darker parts of human nature, his willingness to push the limits of language and form.
And Baudelaire, with his fascination with city life, with the beauty you can find in the gritty and the grotesque, also seems to have influenced Ginsberg's work.
It's as if he took these different things, Whitman's democratic spirit, Rimbaud's rebellious fire, Baudelaire's urban sensibility, and made them into something that was both deeply personal and universal.
Exactly. He took what he learned from these writers and created something new, something that was both grounded in tradition and totally original.
This mix of influences is key to understanding Ginsberg's work. It wasn't just rebellion for the sake of rebelling. It was a conscious and informed rebellion built on a deep understanding of literary history.
And that leads us to San Francisco in the 1950s, a city that was quickly becoming a center for artists, writers, and freethinkers who were disillusioned with mainstream American culture.
What about San Francisco? What made it such a good place for the Beat generation?
Well, San Francisco had a long history of bohemianism and countercultural movements. It was a city that embraced being different, that celebrated individuality, that gave a safe space to those who felt like outsiders in other parts of the country.
It was a place where people could try new things, explore new ideas, and challenge the status quo without being judged.
Exactly. And by the 1950s, this countercultural energy was really growing. The Beat generation was forming with writers like Kerouac Ginsburg and Burroughs at the front.
They weren't just writing, they were performing, they were publishing, they were creating this whole new scene that challenged the established literary world.
They were shaking things up, pushing boundaries, and they were helping to define a new era in American culture.
And Ginsberg, with his charisma, his energy, his willingness to be outrageous, was right at the center of it.
He was a force of nature. And the Six Gallery reading in 1955, when he first performed, Howl became this defining moment for the Beat generation. It was a moment that got the attention of the literary world.
From what I've read, it was a declaration of independence, a rejection of conformity, a celebration of the wild, untamed spirit that was at the heart of the Beat movement.
And Howl, with its raw emotion, its unflinching look at the dark side of American life, its celebration of the outcasts and the marginalized became the anthem for this new generation of rebels and seekers.
It wasn't just the words on the page, right?
Yeah.
Ginsberg's performance style was also groundbreaking. He wasn't just reading poetry, he was living it, transforming the reading into a visceral, almost shamanistic experience.
Right. He wasn't afraid to scream, to chant, to move his body, to connect with his audience on a primal emotional level. He was pushing the boundaries of what poetry could be and changing the relationship between the poet and the audience.
That energy, that rawness, that willingness to break the mold is what made him such a captivating and controversial figure.
He was a lightning rod, attracting both praise and criticism. And the controversy around Howl, especially the obscenity trial that happened after it was published, just made him more famous.
It's kind of ironic, isn't it? A poem that was basically a plea for compassion, for understanding, for a kinder and fairer world, ended up being called obscene and dangerous.
It says a lot about the anxieties of that time, the fear of anything that challenged how things were, the desire to silence voices that spoke truth to power.
But Ginsberg didn't back down. He fought back, and by doing so, he helped create more freedom of expression in art and literature.
And that legacy still inspires artists and writers today. Ginsberg's work reminds us that art can be a powerful force for social change, that poetry can fight injustice, and that personal stories can be deeply political.
So we've talked about Ginsberg's family, his influences, his journey to San Francisco, the rise of the Beat generation, and the controversy around Howe. But there's one more piece to look at the poem itself.
Yeah, you're right. We've talked around it, but now it's time to dive into the heart of Howl, to look at its themes, its imagery, its language, and to understand how all these parts come together to make such a powerful and lasting work of art.
That's the perfect way to move into the final part of our deep dive. We'll take a closer look at Howe and see what it tells us about the connection between creativity and mental illness. Okay, so we're back and ready to really dig into Howe.
Like you said earlier, Howl is a complicated poem with lots of layers, and people are still interested in it today.
Yeah. Before we started this deep dive, I have to admit, I thought of Howl as this kind of like chaotic explosion of anger and frustration.
It's definitely intense and emotional, but there's more to it than just that.
For sure. So let's break it down. It's divided into 3 parts, right?
Yeah, and each one focuses on something different, but they're all connected, and that makes it a strong and cohesive work of art.
Okay, the most well-known one starts with that famous line, "I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness, starving, hysterical, naked."
It really grabs your attention from the beginning and sets you up for a poem that's going to be super honest and personal.
Right, and it's not just personal. He's talking about a whole generation, the best minds, as he calls them, being crushed by society's pressures, by conformity, by the worries of the Cold War.
That's right. Ginsberg saw himself and the other beat writers as like casualties of this environment, victims of a society that wanted everyone to be the same and that was scared of people who were different.
And he doesn't just tell us this. He shows us with these vivid, sometimes disturbing images of these best minds trying to survive in a world that doesn't get them or want them.
He uses this technique called anaphora, where he repeats the word who at the beginning of line after line to create this feeling of unstoppable movement, like being carried away by something you can't control.
It's like he's trying to capture the feeling of chaos, the energy, the pure desperation of a whole generation dealing with the weight of the world.
And his language adds to this feeling of chaos. He breaks away from the typical rules of poetry and uses a more everyday, slangy style that sounds like how people really talk.
It makes it feel immediate and raw and real, like you're right there with Ginsberg and everyone else.
And he didn't shy away from pushing the limits. He used swear words, sexual stuff, drug references, anything to wake people up.
He saw hypocrisy all over, and he talked about it even if it meant getting censored or sued.
That's what makes Howl so powerful, that fearlessness, that rawness. It's a poem that demands to be heard, that speaks truth to power no matter what.
So part one sets the scene, introduces us to Ginsberg's world and his generation's struggles. What about part two? What's going on there?
Part two shifts from the individual to society. Ginsberg brings in this character called Moloch, who represents all the bad stuff in modern society, like greed, violence, conformity, chasing money.
So Moloch is like the embodiment of the forces crushing the best minds, this monster that eats up individuality and creativity and compassion.
It's a strong symbol, and Ginsberg uses these harsh, almost biblical images to show a society that's lost its way, a society that's given up its soul for progress.
And you can feel the anger, the outrage in part two. It's like Ginsberg is yelling at the sky, raging against the injustice, the hypocrisy, the sheer insanity of it all.
But even with all that anger, there's a little bit of hope, a feeling that the best minds of his generation could still change things.
Okay, so we have the individual struggles in part one, the critique of society in part two. Where does part three fit in?
Part three is more personal and introspective. Ginsberg talks to Carl Solomon, a fellow patient he met at the New York State Psychiatric Institute.
And Carl Solomon represents all those who've been pushed aside, judged, called mad by a society that doesn't understand them.
Exactly. And part three becomes this thoughtful, almost mournful reflection on madness, on being alone, on trying to connect with people in a world that often feels lonely and strange.
There's a vulnerability in part three that's different from the anger in part two, but it's still connected to those themes.
Yeah, it's like Ginsberg is saying that even with all the chaos and pain and madness, there's still room for love and caring and connecting with other people.
And that's what makes Howl such a great work of art. It's not just a protest poem or a social critique. It's also a poem about being human, about the things that connect us, even when things are bad.
It recognizes the pain and suffering and madness, but it doesn't give in to despair. It says that hope and redemption are still possible, that you can find beauty and meaning even in the chaos.
And that message, that refusal to give up on humanity, is just as important now as it was when Ginsberg wrote Howl over 50 years ago.
We're still dealing with many of the same problems, like social injustice, corruption, messing up the environment, the pressure to be like everyone else, the fear of people who are different.
And when the world feels overwhelming, Howl reminds us that we're not alone in our struggles, that there's strength in being together, that art can help us resist and heal.
Ginsberg's life and work make us think about the hard truths of ourselves and the world. They make us question what we think challenge the way things are, speak up against unfairness, and embrace the power of art to motivate us, make us think, and connect us to something bigger than ourselves.
Yeah, that's a challenge worth taking on. It's about finding our own voices, understanding ourselves, and working to make a more just and caring world.
And that's what the Mad Genius thesis is all about. It's about looking at the complex relationship between creativity and mental illness and seeing how art can challenge us, heal us, and inspire us.
Well, that's all the time we have for this episode of the Mad Genius Thesis. We hope you'll join us next time for another deep dive into the lives and works of other amazing people who make us rethink what it means to be creative and what it means to be human.